Alright, so in this question, the first part asks you to classify the angles below, and angles 1 and 2, I circled them in red, would be in the same position, meaning they're both in upper right corner, so I would call them corresponding. So I'm going to write corresponding. So that would be the name, and then because the lines are given as parallel, I could also say they're congruent. It's not being asked, but that is something I do know. The second pair of angles is 3 and 4, and they are both on the interior of the two parallel lines in the bottom, and they're on the same side of the transversal. So I would call them consecutive interior. So consecutive interior angles. And they are not congruent, then they would be considered supplementary. So again, I didn't have to write that, but I will because it's going to help us later. Okay, so the reason why I'm making this video is mostly for the solving of the quadratic because some of us are still struggling with it. So I'm going to focus on that. And you have to solve for x. If you look over here, both of these angles are consecutive interior. So they're not congruent, but we know that they would have to be supplementary. So the sum would have to be 180. So the equation that I create would involve me adding the two angles together and setting them equal to 180 degrees. And as soon as I see a square in my equation, I know right away that this is a quadratic equation. And I have a couple options, and I can either use the quadratic formula, which works for every quadratic, or I can use factoring. And I'm going to work out both of them. Each one will start by setting everything equal to 0. So essentially, I would be subtracting 180 from both sides, and I would end up getting negative 110 equals to 0. So if you're more of a factoring person, you're going to look for two numbers that multiply to negative 110 and add up to negative 1. Now you notice I jumped directly to the factored form because it starts with a plain x squared, so I know that my only options would have to be x and x. So the two numbers that would work for me would be negative 11 and 10. And one little trick that I use in my head is if they add up to negative 1, I would know that they have to be 1 away from each other. So I'm looking for numbers that are like 3 and 4, 4 and 5, 5 and 6, and in this case, negative 11 and 10 worked for me. So this means this has to be negative 11 and this has to be 10, and they're still equal to 0. My two solutions would be the two values that make each factor equal to 0. So in the first case, it would have to be 11, and in the second case, it would have to be negative 11. And again, I'm just solving x minus 11 equal to 0. I add 11 to both sides, that's how I get this answer. And here I'm just solving x plus 10 equal to 0, and I'm subtracting 10 from each side. And now that I'm doing this, I'm realizing that this should have been negative 10 instead. So I'm going to fix that. And okay, so then I get my negative 10. So those are my two solutions, and they actually both worked because when I plug in 11, I get 121 minus 11, which is 110, supplementary to 70. So x equals 11 worked. And then if you try x equals negative 10, you get 100 minus negative 10, which also gives you 110, which is positive angle. So they both work. Okay? Now, the second option for you is to use the quadratic formula, which is x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, and that is something that I can provide to you in class because that would be on like a reference sheet for us if we took the part test or something. But in any case, so a, b, and c would be the coefficients of your terms if you look at them in order. So a would have to be my coefficient in front of x squared. And remember my equation was x squared minus x minus 110. So the coefficient in front of x squared is 1. The coefficient in front of x is negative 1. And constant is negative 110. So your x values would be 1 plus or minus square root of 1 minus 4 times 1 times negative 110 all over 2a. So 2 times 1. So we get 1 plus or minus square root of 441 over 2. And I get two solutions. 1 plus or minus 21 over 2 and 1 minus 21 over 2. This would give you 20. So if I do the plus, I don't know why I wrote the minus here. So if I do the plus, I get 22 over 2, which gives me the 11. And on the bottom, if I do 1 minus 21, I get negative 20 over 2, and that gives me the negative 10. And again, as before, both worked. So either approach is fine.